All right, let's talk about some undrafted free agents from the 2022 draft class, shall we?
Do you have the time to listen to me grind? Take down the film watchers and nerds all at once. I am one of those skeptical of status quo. Lazy.
All right, first thing to know is I've been doing this a long time. I've mostly been hurt, and you should know if you're going to go down this route, you're going to experience more pain than joy. Just know that. Just embrace the process for the sake of saying I saw it coming, even though really you're just taking a lot of shots, and eventually you're going to hit. Undrafted free agents hit at a relatively low rate. When you take into account the number of undrafted free agents that are signed every year, it's an incredibly low rate. Now, the good thing is the same patterns really are true for all positions when you're undrafted as well as when you're drafted. So we're looking for productive players that have ended up in interesting landing spots. It's pretty much a similar process. Now, the benefit to them is that hardly any of them get drafted in your rookie draft. Most are waiver wire picks, and mostly because they tend to have a longer career arc, a longer developmental arc. It means you're not really having to draft them as your rookie draft. Now, if you're in a league with a bunch of me's or just me, you might have to, because I might roster them just because I am into this process, and someone in your league is probably pretty deep into the weeds as well in terms of sleepers, and so you have to adjust your league about whether they're rosterable or not. Mostly I say they're just names to know. For example, I wrote up and I've been writing up undrafted free agents for years now, but I officially started it as like a series at DLF where I write up the 3 to 5 players at each position that are interested in undrafted free agents. From the 2021 class, none of them passed the second filter, which is something we'll get to in a moment. It looks ultimately like all the wonder of the 2021 class has been sucked up by Amon-Ra St. Brown, which is where 4th round picks come in. If you take into account 4th round pick, everyone outside that golden range of a top 3 pick and that great hit rate, all the way to undrafted free agent, they account for about 22 to 27% of fantasy relevant seasons in forever. It's fairly consistent. Every draft class produces about the same consistency in terms of players being drafted from that range, 4th round to undrafted free agent, as it does in the first 3 rounds. Now, that doesn't mean you're getting the same number, but the hits relative to draft class are similar. For example, we've seen a lack of top 36 players, or a lack of 2 top 36 players at wide receiver since the 2008 wide receiver class. Doesn't mean we haven't had great players, and if Calvin Ridley had come back last year, we probably would have seen a draft class within that range actually finally have another top 36 player along with DJ Moore, and that's counting 2 top 36 seasons, by the way, because we like to look for not one-hit wonders when we can. Undrafted free agents has followed a similar pattern. Since around 2008, we've seen a lack of 4th round to undrafted free agent players really hit from different draft classes. We've seen at least one with 2 top 24 PPR wide receiver seasons, because we lower our boundaries a bit when we're looking in this kind of a range, but the fact that we haven't seen too many of them reflects how many wide receivers we've seen ultimately hit the higher upsides as well. And so I think that consistency in terms of hits and undrafted free agent relevance is going to continue. What does all that mean? Not much. Marcus Callaway from 2 years ago is one of the only wide receivers who's passed my second filter and still remains interesting. And Hunter Renfrow and also Amon-Ra St. Brown, both last year, 4th round pick to undrafted free agents, actually had a top 12 season in Hunter Renfrow's case, and Amon-Ra St. Brown obviously had a top 24 season in his rookie season, which is incredibly rare to a player drafted in that range. Now, the reason I consider them all to be one group, largely most of the time, is because players drafted between rounds 5 and 7 almost don't matter. We have Antonio Brown at wide receiver. There's very few hits. Now there's more hits at running back, which is why those percentages go up a little bit at that position, but mostly I think NFL teams between rounds 4 to 7 are mostly taking players that aren't wide receivers, and they aren't running backs, and they aren't tight ends. They're football players, and the teams have a specific usage, special teams, or a specific role in mind, or maybe they want to try converting them to something else. They're typically not thinking about starting those players in roles that we like for fantasy football. That's my speculation on why the hit rates drop off so dramatically between rounds 5 and 7, to the point that undrafted free agents, a larger percentage of hits in fantasy actually come from undrafted free agents than players between rounds 5 and 7, and that's kind of stark when we consider how important draft capital is. My explanation for that is that teams are looking for other kind of players. They're not looking for wide receivers to catch 1,000-yard seasons or running backs to run for 1,000 yards rushing. They're looking for football players, which is always worth keeping in mind. That's typically what NFL teams are more interested in than fantasy, so that kind of makes sense. Alright, what does that mean for undrafted free agents? And we're just going to deal with undrafted free agents in this video, not later round gems, not the 4th round star that I'm really interested in, because consistency, and also that's probably the title of the video, and also there's a dearth of them, and so there tends to be more, and I need to be precise, offer a few names I think you should put on your list of, if you see something interesting, then you should know that is actually not the first interesting thing that they've done. That brings me to the second filter, and I've got a lot of videos on this through the years, obviously, and a lot of articles, but I just wanted to do a quick rundown. Now, the second filter, as I'm calling it, as if it's an exact process, really the main impetus, the main factor in the second filter, whatever that means, is that they stay on the roster. I know that sounds like bare minimum, but it cuts out a lot of that block. Everyone, when you start talking about the value of undrafted free agents, is going to talk about how many of them actually go to an interesting landing spot with even decent college production from smaller conferences or less often drafted conferences, and then remain on the roster by the time that season starts. The group actually drops dramatically by the time we play game 1. And how many are still on the roster the following year? Drops dramatically again. Now, this isn't perfect. You're still going to have way too many in the player pool, but the idea that there's thousands of undrafted free agents even past that simple test is incorrect. I've been tracking it a while, and actually it reduces into a fairly searchable and filterable list. Check out my database for past historical examples, and also just look at current productive stars like Adam Thielen, or Tyrell Williams was an undrafted free agent player once who had a good season. I think Cameron Meredith was a later round pick rather than an undrafted free agent. He's one or the other. They do show up fairly relatively. Very, very few are Adam Thielen, but to be fair, very few first round picks are Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. Mostly you get Amari Cooper, and he's been great, or DJ Moore, and he's been great. But very, very few of that top. But yeah, very few of them hit. And so there might be more competition for them getting on your roster these days, and increasingly so as the age of information increases. But ultimately, there's still an edge there. The value of them is dropping. You don't have to spend a 3rd round pick on them most of the time, or a 4th. Sometimes you're just aware of them, and when they do something or remain on the roster in the following season, you know more than others that they are worth being on your radar. Put them on your watch list. The other part of that second filter is, do they do anything? Now, they don't have to Amon-Ra St. Brown, and they more have to Adam Thielen, who did relatively little his first year, but did have a couple good games. They get on the field, they earn targets, maybe when a situation flags because of injuries or the team's trying to shake things up. That can mislead you. Look up a man named Tana Gentry once in a while. I really thought we were seeing some signs with him on the Bears that he was breaking through. He kept being signed off the practice squad onto the active roster, earning targets that first year, and it just kind of withered on the vine, as most are going to do. That is another positive sign. So all of the indicators that we're looking for are kind of exactly the same as those you're used to with 1st or 3rd round picks, but you should just expect a lower range of outcomes. The fact that you get on the field, or maybe earn a target, or create a target, for yourself as an undrafted free agent, especially in your rookie season, is kind of even more impressive, because no one expects you to do it. There's no path to you getting that target. You have to create it entirely for yourself. All of that being said, who are the undrafted free agents in the 2022 class that I currently already knew of pre-draft? Most of them I knew about pre-draft, and got signed to relatively interesting landing spots. Yeah, the first one's going to be Justin Ross, undrafted free agent to the Kansas City Chiefs. Pretty much everyone going to Kansas City as a lower drafted prospect is probably going to get some interest, because no one really wants to believe in Juju, and despite the increased hype with Sky Moore, So we're going to be looking for athletic freaks that have almost no draft capital to be the next Tyreek Hill. Now, is Justin Ross that? Kind of. He has no draft capital, and he was fairly athletic back in his day. You might remember in pre-draft, he showed up for me because part of my process was breaking down their individual production and seeing how they made it. His pre-draft score is kind of mediocre. It's like a 6.6. That would be a mediocre score for a wide receiver drafted in the 3rd round, for example, and ultimately not that interesting. But digging into his profile a little bit, I found out that that first season was actually one of the best age-adjusted seasons in this class or even the previous class. It was a really impressive season, especially considering he was playing with T. Higgins. I also talked about Scott Barrett about this for the Dynasty Crossroads. Probably have to cut that. This isn't a Dynasty Crossroads episode. But anyway, he was actually really impressive that first year. Suffered a major catastrophic injury and didn't really seem to come back to being the same player after that initial year. Although he did play for several years before being undrafted this year as a 2022 Kansas City Chief wide receiver. One of the reasons that he was signed is he finally got cleared, full clearance from his medical evaluation. Does that mean he's fully healthy now, finally? No, he was playing football after that injury. He's a fully mobile human being, and that means he's fully healthy. Is he the same player we saw when he was 18? Maybe. Was that player we saw when he was 18 really going to be one of the better prospects from this class, and the injury derailed him? Don't know. But as an undrafted free agent that you maybe have to roster as a late third round pick, I've been spending early thirds on him because people in my league all know about Justin Ross, and I love these guys. I really like prospecting undrafted free agents, so I want to make sure I snag him, but I probably don't have to be honest with you, because again, what I'm expecting this year is for him to maybe stay on the depth chart by day one, and then maybe to get on the field at some point, and then maybe when there's an injury or an event or the team shakes something up, he actually does something kind of interesting on the field in one game that wouldn't show up in season-long statistics, and then remains on the roster for the following season. Like, this is a long burn. This is a tight end of wide receiver. They're not gonna Amon-Ra St. Brown. It can actually happen, but we're not gonna believe that's what we're looking for. Yeah, but for right now, at almost zero value or a 4th round pick, I don't know about you, but I get to the 4th round or late 3rd round, and I'm basically drafting names I recognize. Anyway, I think a wide receiver on the Kansas City Chiefs with that one season of amazing production, and maybe we can hope he's healthy again. Yeah, he's top of my list for the undrafted free agent class in 2022 right now. The next guy I have in terms of overall draft board ranks is a tight end, so a long, slow burn anyway. Jalen Widdemeyer. My pre-draft model liked him fairly well. He scored a 6.2, which is, for a tight end, yeah, it's okay. He's undrafted to the Buffalo Bills, which isn't a particularly great landing spot, but it is a very productive team. It's passing for about 60.3% of its overall attempts, and it's done a lot to try and surround Josh Allen, not only with Stefon Diggs, but other potential pass catchers, and hasn't really bolstered up the running back core to the extent that we should expect more of those overall team attempts to go towards the rushing game particularly. So I think it's going to continue to be a productive team where there are targets and touchdowns, and that's all positive. And to be fair, if you want to throw more narrative in there, Buffalo has shown an ability to develop players that come from lesser spots, like Josh Allen. Or lesser college statistics, should we say. No, let's not, because Josh Allen's owned us too much. We're not going to remind everyone of it. He's not someone I'm rostering, to be honest. He's a tight end who should take longer anyway. But if I see positive news this offseason, if he keeps his spot on the depth chart, if I'm in a league that's 2 tight end or tight end premium, here's a name I want to keep in the back of my mind or on my watch list. So I'm throwing him out to you. And because it's a tight end position, so the value relatively rarely changes. It just gets an automatic boost in my rankings compared to others. We're already talking about a player I wouldn't draft in the 3rd round, but I think he's fairly interesting as an undrafted free agent prospect. Next guy I have in my overall draft board rankings that's an undrafted free agent is a quarterback. So if you're playing Superflex, a name to keep in mind. I think it's really interesting New England added 2 depth quarterbacks this year. I like Matt Jones. I don't mind so much that he's from an older school where there's literally no rushing value, but I found it interesting. Derek King goes to an interesting landing spot on a team that obviously has a history of developing quarterbacks from low draft capital, and I'm nowhere near this take should that statement be made, but I think it's fairly interesting. He had over 200 passing attempts in his age 20 and age 22 season, and he was above average in CPO relative to his conference, and he's coming from like the ACC Coastal. which isn't great, but it's not nothing. It's not the MCA, the MAC. Yeah, it is a MAC. Yeah, MAC West or wherever it is, where I've rostered plenty of players from. So it's not a know-nothing conference. And based on the ACC average, who is actually above average completion percentage in those 2 years, don't really know the full story about the other years yet, because, again, it's just an undrafted free agent, and I'm doing so much catch-up work with players that especially quarterbacks, that I haven't done enough due diligence on yet. But I think he's really interesting, especially because he's got a definite rushing element to his game compared to Mac Jones. So we're talking about a player I definitely don't roster even in Superflex, but I do keep on my radar because he had like 33% of the team's receiving rushing yards in those 2 years where he had over 200 passing attempts, and also like 41% of the team's market share of rushing touchdowns, I think. He's very much a rusher, and he seems to be fairly accurate relative to the ACC, and in terms of his passing, it's interesting to me that the Patriots add 2 depth quarterbacks when I thought Mac Jones was being a little underrated because of his lack of rushing. So I'm just throwing his name out here. Again, he will be on my watch list somewhere, and I'll probably forget who he is next time I see his name, but for now I'm keeping on my radar. Next is a whole plethora of running backs, and running backs really are where we just add the depth on the back of our roster, especially in Dynasty. It's what our bench should mostly be, running backs, unfortunately, especially because more players with lower draft capital actually break into fantasy relevance, at least into the top 24, at running back than any other position. So there's a man named Brian Kobach. He's coming from Toledo, which isn't great. It's the MAC West conference that I was trying to quote earlier, but he did have over 900 rushing yards his very first season, and he had 2 years with over 1,000 rushing yards, just if you like the blanket stats. Now his best and last adjusted yards per team attempt, go into a little bit more of an advanced stat that you don't care about, but it weights receiving yards a little bit. It's actually right on the average of players who hit in the NFL. That's not as impressive for a player who's undrafted to Minnesota behind, but it is a player who was particularly productive in the MAC West, but as a running back and fairly early on, after playing 4 years. Again, it's a death running back ad. Let's not get too excited. I don't know he's going to do anything in the NFL should injuries or opportunity in the depth chart open up. But he is a name that stuck out to me pre-draft. When I added him into the database, he scored a 7.4 points per game in my pre-draft model, which is decent. It's actually the most decent mark of anyone I've mentioned so far pre-draft. So that best and last year really pushed him up a little bit. Post-draft, even as an undrafted free agent, he gets a fairly mediocre score, which stands out to me. An undrafted free agent with a somewhat middling post-draft score is actually interesting. We have to look into him a little bit more. Obviously, he's behind a plethora of running backs on the Minnesota depth chart, but he was actually productive in school, and we roster running backs in Dynasty is what we do. I actually have him ranked above the next undrafted free agent I think people might be more aware of, which is Zonovan Knight, going to the New York Jets. Don't know why anyone would be interested in the depth running backs of the New York Jets at this point with Breece Hall in town, but they are. Zonovan Knight is someone that was mentioned even more in the pre-draft process, it feels like. I wasn't overly impressed with him. He did have 3 years over 700 rushing yards. He was more of a role player, 2 years with 20 plus receptions, which is good. I'm imagining on tape he looks better, and the role-playing nature is making him look worse in my pre-draft model, but I think he's better known. I just think he's much more buried. At least Kobach is going to a depth chart with a much more talented, probably, running back who's had injury concerns. So yeah, I gave Kobach a slight nod compared to Zonovan Knight. Next guy on my list is just pure fun. Linebacker, turn running back, turn linebacker, turn running back, Abram Smith. If you listen to any of my pre-draft coverage, there's not much to like here, but he did have an incredibly productive rushing season in that last year, like over 1,600 rushing yards. Not much of a pass catcher, mostly a big boy playing the running back position because he wasn't having much success at linebacker. I just think he's an interesting name. He's gone to New Orleans, who has Alvin Kamara, who's probably the best part of the receiving core if Michael Thomas really is finished at this point. But Abram Smith, why not? He's definitely an undrafted free agent. I really enjoyed that one season of his production that he had. In college, he's now going to a not terrible landing spot in terms of opportunity and also in terms of the team's ability to develop talent, so I don't mind it. Next, you've got Ronnie Rivers, I think his name is. Yeah. Not a lot of rushing from the MWC, but he did have an 800 rushing yard season and a lot of receptions. That's probably just team and scheme and something else, but a lot of receptions will pique my interest down this deep into undrafted free agent ranks from a single class. I don't think he's particularly notable, but he could be a receiving role player for Arizona, actually, is a team that he's gone to. Next up and last up is Trey Turner. I don't see a world where Trey Turner gets opportunity in the Minnesota depth chart, and again, especially with Kobach trying to somehow find opportunity behind Cook. Not also going to happen, but Trey Turner is probably well down the depth chart, but he is someone that showed up with a slightly above mediocre pre-draft score for me. But I don't see a world where he gets opportunity, but he is the last undrafted free agent that I'm looking at. He's a late bloomer, a 4-year player. Stats look good for a college player, is my note in my pre-draft process, and probably not for an NFL player, but he's the very last undrafted free agent that I'm currently ranking, so I thought I'd throw him out there. Alright, just off the top of my head, quick read through the undrafted free agents I currently have ranked in a 5-round draft board, which is already probably too deep. I think some of those players are interesting. I would encourage you to learn more about them and also just keep your ear to the ground this preseason, this training season, and we're going to hear positive stories and puff pieces. These are the types of players that I actually keep my ear tuned to. It's not that I'm suddenly going to roster them if I get positive news, but it does give me a second tick that they are traveling in the right direction, whereas it might be some other people's first note that these players might be of interest, and I find it just gives me a slight edge to them, especially in leagues where, and most leagues, you probably shouldn't be rostering most of these players as undrafted free agents, right? And then if they stay on the depth chart by day one, and then if they do something, just catch a few targets, play a role in a game here or there, and more positive news comes out, you never know. Mostly we know they're not going to do anything, but undrafted free agents are easy to add to your roster. They can show the biggest value swing, even if they just have somewhat of a relevant season. Going from nothing to being worth a second-round pick is a lot higher of a value swing than most wide receivers outside of those very big hits drafted in the first round can really go through. They don't have access to that very top value, because we'll always remember they're undrafted free agents, all 4th-round picks. So that whole group always gets somewhat dinged. Stephon Diggs right now, I think, is somewhat undervalued because he wasn't a 1st-round pick. Believe it or not, T.Y. Hilton for his whole career. Even when they hit, they are somewhat tainted by a memory of the fact they weren't drafted in the first 3 rounds, or the first 2 rounds, or the 1st round. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. We're mostly searching for point players, and most of them aren't going to do anything, like most drafted wide receivers and running backs. But on average, since 2000, 2 players drafted round 4 to an undrafted free agent status have actually had at least one top 24 season. 2 of them. Now, sometimes that takes 3 years to happen in the NFL, which is why we're trying to play the long game with them, but they are worth looking at, mainly because, although increasingly people are, so far, we're pretty much by ourselves. If you go check out my database right now, you'll find stats on all these guys and probably more. I keep making videos and then I get comments the next day and I've already updated for something else. I'm sorry, it's an active process in an active preseason, but I'm trying to keep you all updated as much as I can in the videos, but the database is always going to be what I update first. Or primarily. That's my main focus, to make sure everyone has the data and can have their own fun. Anyway, let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Hey, thanks for checking out another video. If you could like, subscribe, comment, that'd all be great. But also check out the rest of the channels and follow my Patreon link to see what I'm up to over there. And the Linktree link, I guess, is going to take you to easy access to my podcast, the articles I'm writing over there at DLF, as well as most of the other things I'm up to. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks very much.